Really worked in many organizations. What's the most toxic leadership behavior you've seen that often gets overlooked?
When you have a leader that is inherently insecure and takes that out on their team, that becomes extremely toxic. We confuse confidence and competence. And I think that's where the gender aspect very quickly comes in. You can't grow the number of leadership positions to create equality. Some will have to make space. I often like to think that men show a lot more emotion at work because anger is also an emotion. And so we count female tears and put them under a magnifying glass, and we completely accept all the other emotions. I think men are equally emotional to women, and so that needs a reframe. Hope is what you find at the bottom of Pandora's box. It's the only thing we have, and we can afford to give up hope.
Marijn Wiersma, corporate anthropologist, strategist, shaping the future of impact.
She's at the forefront of moving capital toward women and making change happen where it matters most.
Over 90 countries, countless conversations with leaders, innovators, and changemakers.
Author of SOS, a navigation guide for women at work, showing everyone how work can be fairer, more productive, and more inclusive.
The hope, the optimism, but also making space for the outrage and the anxiety of where we are in the world. To me, that's an incredibly powerful combination, this outrage and optimism.
Welcome back to Catch The Upswing. I'm excited to be back with Marijn Wiersma, corporate anthropologist and the author of SOS, the book we discussed in our last episode. And today we want to dive a little bit deeper into some of the topics related to the book, going a bit broader, beyond what's directly mentioned in the book, but other topics that we know are of interest to our audience. And we've also collected a few questions from around the world that we want to address in this episode.
Cool. Looking forward.
So, Marijn, let's start with leadership and culture. We already discussed leadership in our last episode, but what I'm really curious about is you shared a little bit last time. You've really worked in many organizations, big ones, small ones, but also some really major organizations. And I wonder, what's the most toxic leadership behavior you've seen that often gets overlooked?
Yeah. I'm debating if I should use the word narcissism or insecurity, but I think they're probably two sides of the same coin. Is when you have a leader that is inherently insecure and takes that out on their team, that becomes extremely toxic.
So that is, can you make that a bit more concrete? Like, how does that, for example, show up in a team setting?
So somebody then has to prove that they are worthy all the time.
By putting other people down?
So you put other people down. It can result in shouting at other people, shutting down others' ideas. I mean, all the things you don't want in a leader, really. And interestingly, to this date, and this baffles me, those people are still surfacing into leadership positions. I think the percentage of narcissists in leadership is higher than the percentage of narcissists in daily life, I mean, in the population.
And I think it's so interesting because I can definitely think of a number of narcissists that I've experienced in my own career journey. And I think that's similar for many who have been in the workplace for a while. And I wonder, how is it that this behavior gets tolerated? Is it because these people bulldoze their way up, or what is it? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, I think here we confuse confidence and competence.
A quick note of thanks and a small invitation. If you're enjoying this podcast, subscribing is one of the easiest ways to support the work and help these conversations travel further. I really appreciate you being here.
And so these people show up in a very confident way, and we conflate it with competence. And I think that's where the gender aspect very quickly comes in, that often women are less conditioned to show up confidently, And so a lot of the competence is also missed.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that it's also when, for example, evaluating those leaders, that their assumed confidence is weighted more strongly than their interpersonal skills and
Yes.
the well-being in the team or the culture that they set?
Yes.
Because of the hard facts of results or the presumed competence that they bring in the subject matter area.
Yes. And of the way they present themselves, and they know how to advocate for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like smokes and mirrors, but they have perfectioned that because they
Mm-hmm.
need it to believe in themselves, and they know how to sell that to the world.
Yeah.
Particularly in a like-minded culture.
Yeah. So if you are on a team and your leader is like that, is there an SOS move other than get the hell out of there?
Well, then it becomes manager. And if you're smart about doing that, and if you can give this person the feeling that the ideas that he or she came up with are theirs, even if that is what you've been feeding them. And if you're low ego but smart, I think that you can manage a relationship for quite a long time. They can be really, really wonderful people because they need to fill that hole in themselves. They need that connection. They really want you to like them. So if you do that in a respectful way, it can go a long way, but it will invariably break at some point.
Yeah, that's definitely difficult.
Yeah.
Let's go back to this topic of inclusive workplaces. What is the hardest truth leaders need to hear if they want to keep top female talent?
Well, at the moment, I think make space. I think that's a very hard truth people don't like to hear. Because you can't grow the number of leadership positions to create equality. So some will have to make space. And I see no harm at all in positive discrimination in terms of hiring practices or a quota. I think it's ridiculous that this is still a topic and women are underrepresented, wildly underrepresented in many, many, many different workplaces.
Yeah. And often it's just intentionality, right? It's like you have a target for profit. You should have a target for representation.
It's easy. I mean, it's not difficult. And I don't buy the argument we can't find the women.
Yeah.
You haven't looked hard enough or
Right.
you haven't asked the right people, or you have to reinterrogate your what does good looks like assumptions.
Yeah. Very interesting. Is there one change that, in your opinion, would have the fastest impact on workplace equality? Like if leaders had one thing they could implement? Would it be setting a target?
Targets help. What gets measured gets done in the end. I was leaning to also pay equity. So I would hinge between pay equity and metrics.
Yeah. Interesting. And in relation to pay equity, it's actually interesting because, it starts with measuring it so you understand the magnitude of the problem. But then we've also seen big companies who basically overnight eliminated their gender pay gap by just closing it. So I think we've also seen interesting examples that it can be done. You just have to have,
and of
the
course,
willingness
closing
to do
the
it.
pay gap overnight doesn't change the culture overnight.
Right.
So there will be a time lapse that you will need to allow for to I'm trying to think if that would...
I think it sets an example of what gets valued,
Yes.
Because women are undervalued in the workplace. And unfortunately, we still link value to monetary value. And so in that sense, I think it's a first step to really valuing women, not only, holistically, but also their contributions in terms of monetary reward. Yeah, those are great ones. Something I've been reflecting a bit more about is what we discussed in our earlier episode about leadership and emotion. And we discussed imposter syndrome, and we were, kind of debating, is it really more prevalent in women, or is it that men don't talk about it as much, don't admit it, don't acknowledge it, because it's even harder for them culturally to admit it oftentimes. And there's also this whole debate about leadership and emotion. And so something, for instance, that strikes me is it's often said that being a leader who's also emotional, that emotion undermines your credibility. And I think women get that advice more. And what I see in particular is that when men show emotion in a different context, for example, vulnerability, especially in business and entrepreneurship, they're often perceived as being more human, more relatable, even inspiring. But when women do the same, it's perceived as undermining their credibility. So what do you think about emotion and leadership, and what's your take on this all?
Yeah, so I think when you talk about emotions and leadership, you talk about being authentic as a leader. And I think that is important for men and women alike. What we as a society still need to reconcile with is that we treat men and women alike. I often like to think that men show a lot more emotion at work, because anger is also an emotion. Impatience is also an emotion. And so we count the female tears and put them under a magnifying glass. And we completely accept all the other emotions. I think men are equally emotional to women. And so that needs a reframe. Because then the whole workplace becomes better for all of us. Then we can show up with all the vulnerabilities. And I think I'm not propagating for everybody to be more angry at work. I don't think that is what I'm trying to say. But I think if you're allowed to have all the emotions, it maybe doesn't have to manifest as anger.
Yeah. And I think the other interesting thing is, I think we're sometimes conflating making decisions based on emotion versus decision based on data. And, that's kind of the advice, make decisions based on data, fair enough. But that's very different from not bringing your full self to work, because you're not supposed to show human emotion when you're in the workplace.
Yeah, this is such an interesting point. So I think a lot of decisions get made on gut feeling. And then we collect data to underpin our gut feeling.
Yeah. When I first joined the workplace, there was this joke that you make a decision as management based on gut feeling, and then you hire McKinsey so they find data and a reason to justify that decision.
To say, exactly.
So I have collected a few questions from our community from around the world. And I'd like to start with a question from Andia from Kenya, who's asking you, can you tell us more about understanding and appreciating feminine leadership traits like empathy, collaboration, and nurturing? And do you perhaps have some examples of how both men and women can adopt them or have adopted them in a workplace context? I can help you brainstorm.
Yes, let's brainstorm together. But maybe to celebrate one of our colleagues, when I think of a nurturing type of leadership or showing up in the workplace, I think of Ashish. And I had it. He holds a leadership position, but has such a big heart and he is somebody that is shamelessly caring. And so if that can manifest in an Indian man, it can manifest in all of us. And so I think that culture really can be really caring, but often that is more, that's a trait that is higher valued in women than it is in men. So,
and your example is interesting because it's a finance person and it's a very data-driven person.
Yes.
So it's not contradictory, but it actually goes hand in hand. Even a very data-focused person can have nurturing qualities in leadership.
Absolutely. Yeah.
How about really appreciating those? What do you think leaders can do, or not only leaders, also teams, what can we all do to make more space for appreciating those feminine leadership traits in both men and women?
Yeah. So I think empathy is is a must-have in the workplace. You cannot operate a team without empathy. Yeah. If you are unable to put yourself in the shoes of the other, and that is hard sometimes because those shoes look completely different from the shoes you grew up in, you've been conditioned in, the privilege you have or may not have. And so there's so many factors that play into that. But if you don't have the Fingerspitzengefühl for that leadership trait, I think leading a healthy team is very difficult.
Yeah.
Bordering impossible.
Right. Yeah,
so I think that is
one.
something we need to talk more about and to have more of in the workplace.
Yeah. I have another question from Liebe in Dubai, and she's asking, what advice would you give women to encourage them to bring their authenticity to the workplace?
Yeah, so how I used to put this, and I haven't thought about this in a long time, it's like almost like you get to work, and then in the Netherlands it's often cold, so you take off your coat, you hang it on a hanger, and then you get rid of a layer of identity, and then you walk into the workplace with, armed with whatever you think you need in the workplace. So what if you keep that coat on, or never, that coat is a symbol of leaving something behind when you get into the workplace. Yeah. What if you show up as your full self? I don't know how to put it. I don't know how to put it in a different way, but it's like not leaving something behind.
Yeah.
And that's a muscle you need to train. It requires courage. Authenticity, strangely enough, requires courage.
Yeah. No, it really does. Yeah. And it's a great symbol, like leaving that coat on and not, transforming yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Don't be a transformer. Yeah.
She also asks, what advice would you give your 20-year-old self looking back on your career journey? And are there any myths that you would dispel?
Well, the myth to be dispelled is you can't have it all, and you don't need to have it all. It's fine. Yeah. So the myth that needs to be dispelled is that of perfectionism and to let go of that. So I was 27 when I entered the workspace. What would I have wanted for my beautiful and 20-year-old self? I would have loved more role models, and who would have been able to give me all kinds of pieces of advice. I was surrounded. The boss was a woman, but in a big office, and a first-generation female leader, not always the ones that you per se want to look up to or want to model yourself onto. And then the rest of my colleagues were guys, and they had the get-on-with-it attitude.
Yeah. And you spoke a bit about this first-generation female leaders in our last episode. So what you shared there is that because they had to fight so hard to get into their place, they weren't necessarily the best role models in making space for other women, mentoring them.
Showing up with all these female leadership traits like vulnerability and empathy and caring. Yeah.
So, and I guess for somebody who is now in their 20s, fortunately, that has already changed a lot. And so I guess the advice would be to look for those role models.
Look for the role models. But interestingly, now that you say it, because we've written a book about women in the workplace, and our youngest author is in her 20s, and she found vulnerability a very foreign concept. You can't, when you're young, show up and be vulnerable. You can only do that as you progress in your career. And she shared this notion of vulnerability with her friends, and they were like taken aback, like, I have to, at least emit a certain confidence, otherwise people won't take me seriously because already of my age. And I found that sad.
And I guess that just also means that those who are further along in their career, who have the privilege of being able to show vulnerability, who can afford to do it, I guess they also really have a role to do so, because they set an example for those who come next.
Yeah, and they have to, when somebody else is courageous enough to show vulnerability, you have to acknowledge it, or at least not to crush it, at a minimum.
And then she also asks, how do you navigate aligning your personal values with the values of the organization you work for?
Yeah, and that is absolutely a must-have for me, and it's crucial. And I remember this very funny conversation with my mom, who was like, jobs are to make money. I was like, no, jobs are to make a difference, and it has to align with who I am. And she was like, that's La La Land, and this was what was mid-90s. I was like, no, this is not La La Land. This is the land that I'm stepping into. And if it doesn't exist, I'll create it. And I've been true to that.
Amazing. So that was your decision-making moment. You actively looked for organizations that shared the values that you stand for.
Yes, and then at some point I did decide to step into a situation working with a complex leader. I knew that in advance, and I think the relationship was good for a good 2 years. And then when that turned, that was the end of it also.
Yeah. I want to take us into the topic of resilience. And I think it's always an important topic, but especially at the moment, what I see in my own network of purpose-driven leaders is that they are really exhausted, and it's hard to persevere in the current environment where there's a lot of negativity, a lot of challenges, and, staying focused on that mission and vision sometimes gets quite hard and just exhausting, and they're drained. How can we all persevere in challenging times?
Yeah, I can't answer role models to every question, can I? But so I think women that have thought about this and have something important to share is Jane Goodall. She has recently published a book of hope. But also somebody like Christiana Figueres with her podcast Outrage and Optimism, and that combination, between giving the perspective, the hope, the optimism, but also making space for the outrage and the anxiety of where we are in the world. I think that is to me, that's an incredibly powerful combination, this outrage and optimism. Yeah. But we do need hope, even if it's, I think hope is what you find at the bottom of Pandora's box. It's the only thing we have. And I don't think we can afford to give up hope.
Yeah. And I think that aspect of hope and optimism is so powerful. And for me personally, where it comes out is surrounding myself with other change makers, other purpose-driven leaders, and sharing that hope and that optimism, right? Because I think we also get a lot of positive energy by surrounding ourselves with others who are also being resilient and encountering challenges, but pushing through.
Yeah, I think to me you are an example of somebody who does that on a very regular basis, to kind of see the bright side, think along the lines of abundance, see the possibilities where others see none.
And I would actually also add humor to the mix, to the point of your book where you talk about heavy issues, but you talk about them in a light way and you use a lot of humor. And you even have a chapter on humor. And I think that can also really help us in those times in particular.
Yeah, it can. You have to take yourself with a grain of salt as humanity, because otherwise it becomes unbearable.
Yeah. I've also wondered, more recently, where this whole aspect of resilience is coming from. And I think for me, reflecting on my own journey, I always thought there are kind of two main drivers. One is having my purpose crystal clear, and that is making an impact on people and planet, so a positive impact in the world. And that purpose is so much bigger than myself, and that's what gives me hope, what allows me to be resilient, to carry on in the face of a lot of adversity. And then the second aspect is just having experienced a lot of challenges, a lot of crises, and so, kind of this feeling of, okay, I've been there before, I've been able to navigate this before, I can take on this next wave that's coming. But more recently, I've noticed that there seems to be kind of a tipping point where it just piles up. So if there are too many negative things, too many challenges. It seems to pile up. And I now wonder, is there like a tipping point where just more difficult experiences don't necessarily make you more resilient, but, perhaps less resilient? Or I wonder, does it just point to the fact that perhaps some healing hasn't taken place? What do you think?
This is a very important point. People are exhausted. And the one thing, so what doesn't help, what to me is not resilience, is always pushing through. So you can be the best problem solver in the world. If you don't take time to decompress, to breathe, to recalibrate, and that means really disengaging from the things that you think are so urgent, and people and planet are huge topics. But if you don't disengage from that once in a while completely and allow for the beautiful silliness of life to kick in, to enjoy the mundane, simple things, to allow yourself the space to breathe, in the end you won't be a good leader, and you will tip over. And exactly as you say, then resilience will bite you back, because then it becomes grit, versus...
Interesting, yeah. We talked recently in our other episode about the daily habits, the importance of daily habits. And I just remembered another daily habit that I really loved. So that was from a male leader who shared... And he's also working on, system change, like challenging topics, but really important purpose. And he said what he does is every day before going to bed, he watches comedy. So he laughs, that's like the last thing he thinks of. And then he says something like, I've never had a nightmare in 20 years or something. And I thought that's so powerful, because if you can just make space to watch, even if it's a tiny bit of comedy, something funny before going to bed, I think that's a nice daily habit I want to try.
Yeah, people come up with the most creative, inventive things, and you can see how that can work, isn't it? You increase your dopamine, you fall asleep, you're happier.
Exactly, yeah. So talking a bit more about systems change, where, a lot of change makers or purpose-driven leaders are trying to reimagine the system, whether it's the financial system or our food system or, the climate, like tackling those grand challenges. How do we keep hope alive when system change feels so slow? Because oftentimes it is a long game.
Yeah, it's a long game and we have very little time.
Yeah.
That's how it feels at the moment.
Yeah.
I don't think I have an answer to that. But what I do is this mix between keep going and taking time to decompress.
Yeah.
And taking that very serious.
Yeah.
And so there is no option of backing out. I think we need to step up, all of us, to have those conversations, to be in the game, to be in it wholeheartedly, and then also shamelessly be able to enjoy life. Because sometimes, that gets in the way. You can't, it feels wrong, you can't, you forget to also be human, be silly, be lovely, be irresponsible, what you would probably count as irresponsible in the grand scheme of things and all the systems change that need to happen.
And I think that's interesting, because sometimes I think people feel like they have to make a choice. Either I have a lifestyle where I enjoy life, or I'm in systems change. But if I'm in systems change, I can't be seen to also be enjoying life because there's no time, because I'm working on something that's so important. So I think that's an interesting one. And what you just mentioned in the earlier question, this outrage and optimism, from inspired by the other podcast, that is also such a powerful concept. So, let it out, be outraged, but then also keep up the optimism and find the balance. And
keep looking for the possibilities. Yeah. I mean, we are insanely inventive as a species. We might still be on a road to extinction, but we may also still innovate our way out of it. And I like to believe the latter, because that otherwise, what's the point?
Yeah. If we think a bit more about navigating relationships in the workplace, a question that I often hear is, how do you truly build allies in the workplace without it feeling transactional? And I think you're somebody who's really good at that. So I was very much looking forward to asking you that question.
So how do you do it?
How do you do it? Yeah, without it feeling transactional.
Yeah. So I think always seeing the other human, not the other leader or the other program manager or the other consultant or whatever role, banker, whatever role it is this person has, the work identity. But look beyond the work identity, find the human, connect at the human level. Humor helps, have a laugh, be a bit silly. I mean, the check-ins that we do at 2X Global, I think I use them a lot also in conversations with the people that we work with externally.
And that's, for those who may not be familiar with the concept, it's a check-in at the beginning of a meeting, for example, where you make sure you hear everybody's voice. So it's a more inclusive space, but it also is kind of an icebreaker when you're in a meeting with new people. And a check-in question could be, for example, what made you smile today? What gives you hope? What's your dream next week? Or whatever it may be.
Exactly. Yeah. And that levels the playing field. It relaxes people. Meetings are often more, it takes 5 minutes out of your meeting. People may think that is inefficient. It's not. It makes the meeting better. It makes people more relaxed. All voices have been heard. People are now more engaged. And relationship building is also a long game. And you have to be serious about it. It cannot.
Right.
Those are not one-off interactions.
Yeah.
You build them over time. And sometimes they're like sandcastles, and they just it doesn't build, and some sandcastles, depending on the weather and the sun, do build.
Yeah.
It's like it can go both ways, and to be okay with that also.
Nice. Yeah. I want to take us into a few more audience questions. So we have a question from Ashish from India, lived in Asia, Middle East, and now in the UK. And he's asking, if a reader could only implement one action from the book tomorrow morning, what would you want them to do?
Yeah, I want leaders to really see the potential in others and help them develop it.
Yeah,
I think that's the one thing I want everybody to do tomorrow morning.
Yeah, perfect. And it's also very concrete, right? There's like very concrete steps you can take. And if you need more inspiration, read the book. There's a lot of great, very tangible advice in there. Another question from Andia from Kenya. So we talked about unconscious bias before and diversity in the workplace. And she asked, how can we tackle unconscious bias, in particular when it comes to single mothers, women with no children or partner, and in relation to women's physical appearance, whether it's beauty standards, weight, race, aspects linked to physical appearance. What have you seen worked in terms of tackling unconscious bias head on?
Well, you need to make your unconscious bias conscious. And that's a very obvious first step. And there's different ways of doing that. There's a test that you can take online. Harvard has developed this unconscious bias test, and you can test your biases on gender, age, race. Highly recommended. So that's challenging your own individual bias. And then organizationally, there's either different trainings, when some are better than others. But to make this a topic of conversation is a start. But it's a really a first step. And then this requires a lot of change in a mindset shift, and that takes more time.
Yeah.
But you need to start somewhere.
Yeah. Great. Final question from Ashish. How do you hope this book will be used? Is it more as a personal reflection, Do you want it to be used in training sessions, in leadership programs, all of the above? How do you want the book to be put to practice?
Yeah, so I think it's a talking piece. So I think it really works in work environments that you can organize workshops around it. You can have you could have trainings around it, but I think what my wish would be is it becomes a movement for a happier and healthier workplace for everybody.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Marijn, for joining us again today and for taking some of the questions that we've been receiving from around the world. Where can people get the book if they haven't yet ordered it or read it?
Well, in a couple of bookshops in the US, but also on Amazon, and for the Dutch readers, bol.com. And we have our own website, SOS Women at Work. And you can find more information on the book there.
Great. And is there another book tour coming? I know you've toured New York and different places around Europe. Can people expect you to come? Chris is asking if you're coming to Norway for a book tour.
Really, if he gets me a Norwegian translator, no problem. We'll translate the book and we'll do a Norwegian tour. But next it's translated into Dutch and published for the Dutch market.
Great. Thank you again, Marijn.
Thank you very much.
This feels like a good moment to share a resource, especially if this conversation has sparked your curiosity about investing in women. 2X Global is a global investor community focused on advancing gender-smart investing. On the website, you'll find research and practical resources on the business case for investing in women, as well as tools that help investors integrate a gender lens across the full investment cycle, from origination and due diligence through value creation and portfolio management, all the way to responsible exits. If you're looking for clarity and hands-on guidance in this space, it's a useful place to explore.